The little black girl ran to the biker across the border yard as a shadow trailed her through the cargo line. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The day started like any other, with the sun slowly rising over the dusty streets, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement. In the distance, the hum of the city echoed, but for the little black girl, it felt as though the world had come to a halt. She had always been aware of the shadows, those dark, lingering figures that seemed to follow her wherever she went. But today, there was something different, something unsettling about the way the shadows moved, almost as if they were alive. She could feel the cold breath of fear creeping up her spine as she glanced over her shoulder, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadow was still there, trailing her, growing closer with every step. Panic started to rise in her chest. She was no longer just a child walking the streets of the neighborhood. She was a fugitive, running from something far more terrifying than the streets could offer. Without a second thought, she ran, her small feet pounding against the hard ground, her breath coming in quick, ragged gasps. As she approached the border yard, the sound of the tires screeching from the nearby trucks filled the air, blending with the rhythmic thumping of her own heartbeat. The yard was always busy, filled with cargo containers and trucks, a place where secrets were often hidden in the shadows. But today, it felt like the only place she could find some semblance of safety. The wind howled, and she saw the silhouette of a biker standing near the entrance. His figure was imposing, his leather jacket catching the light as he leaned against the chain-link fence. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to trust him, but then, she heard the faint whisper of the shadow behind her, closing in. She had no choice. With a surge of adrenaline, she ran toward the biker, her footsteps quick and desperate. The biker turned, his eyes locking with hers, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. The world around them faded away as they shared a silent understanding. The biker didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He just reached out, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her into the safety of the yard. The shadow stopped at the edge of the fence, its dark presence lingering but unable to cross the threshold. The little black girl, her breath still shaky, looked up at the biker, and for the first time that day, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, she had found someone who could protect her from the shadow that had haunted her for so long. The little black girl stood there, her heart still racing, her breath heavy in the cool evening air. The biker had pulled her into the safety of the yard, but her mind was a whirlwind of confusion. What was this place? Who was he? And why had he helped her? She glanced up at the biker, his leather jacket reflecting the faint light from the street lamps, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. The shadow, the one that had chased her from the moment she left home, seemed to have stopped, at least for now. It lingered just beyond the fence, a dark presence that felt more like a memory than a physical threat. She didn't know what it wanted, but she had a sinking feeling that it wasn't done with her yet. The biker's eyes met hers, steady and calm, as though he knew exactly what she was thinking. He didn't say anything at first, just gave her a reassuring nod, before motioning for her to follow him. As they moved deeper into the yard, the sound of trucks and cargo containers echoed around them. The air smelled like gasoline and metal, a sharp contrast to the sweet scent of the flowers in her neighborhood. It was a world she didn't understand, but for the moment, it felt safer than where she had just come from. She followed him without question, her feet moving in sync with his, though her mind was still racing. Every step she took felt like it was bringing her further from the life she had known, from the people who had always looked after her. But that life, whatever it was no longer hers to keep. The biker led her to a small, makeshift shelter near the back of the yard. It was tucked between two large cargo containers, hidden from view. She could barely make out the details in the dim light, but the place felt like a sanctuary. He gestured for her to sit on a worn-out chair that had been shoved into the corner. She hesitated for a moment before sitting down, her hands still trembling from the run. The biker crouched down in front of her, his face shadowed under the brim of his helmet. "You're safe here," he said, his voice low and steady. But we don't have much time. They'll be looking for you. She nodded, but the fear still clung to her like a second skin. Who are they? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The biker didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up and walked over to a small table near the back of the shelter. He grabbed a map, unfolding it slowly as he stared down at the streets marked with sharp, angular lines. It's not who they are, it's what they represent, he said, his tone distant. They're everywhere, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And they won't stop until they get what they want. She could feel the weight of his words settle in the pit of her stomach. What could she possibly have that they wanted? She had nothing but the clothes on her back. What do they want from me? She asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. The biker's eyes softened for a moment, but then he turned back to the map, tracing his finger along the lines. It's not about you. Not directly, he said. It's about something they think you know, something you saw, maybe. He paused, his finger lingering over a spot on the map. And if you know it, they'll do whatever it takes to make sure you don't tell anyone. They'll use you to get what they want. She felt a wave of nausea hit her as the reality of the situation began to settle in. She wasn't just running from some random threat. She was running from people who were willing to do anything to keep their secrets buried. But I don't know anything, she protested, her voice cracking. I don't even know who they are. The biker's expression hardened, and he folded the map back up, his movements sharp. That's exactly why you're in danger, he said, his voice laced with a bitterness she hadn't heard before. You don't know what they're capable of, but I do. And I won't let them get to you. The words hung in the air, heavy with promise. She didn't know who this man was, or why he cared enough to help her, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like there was a chance to survive, a chance to escape whatever it was that had been chasing her. The shadow was still out there, lurking just beyond the fence, but for now, it seemed a little farther away. The biker looked at her again, his gaze intense. Rest up, he said quietly. We'll need to move before daylight. She nodded, her eyes closing as she leaned back in the chair, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She didn't know what the future held, or how she would escape the danger that was still lurking around the corner, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to hope. Just a little bit. The little black girl sat in the worn-out chair, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The shadows outside the shelter still loomed, but they were quieter now, more distant. The biker's words echoed in her mind. They won't stop until they get what they want. She didn't fully understand, but she knew enough to feel the cold grip of fear creeping into her chest again. She had no idea what kind of trouble she had stumbled into, but now there was no turning back. She was in it, deep, and she had to figure out how to survive. The night stretched on, silent except for the occasional rustling of the wind and the distant hum of the trucks moving through the yard. The biker moved around the shelter, checking the small supplies they had. He didn't say much, his movements precise, efficient. There was something about him, something calm and unwavering in the way he operated. It was clear he had been through dangerous situations before, and that experience showed in every step he took. For a moment, she felt a flicker of gratitude. Maybe he's the only reason I'm still alive, she thought. Her eyes flickered to the shadow that still hovered at the edge of the yard. It wasn't close enough to be a direct threat, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for something, waiting for her to make a mistake. She knew she couldn't let her guard down. The biker finally stopped moving and turned to face her. His face was still shadowed under his helmet, but she could see the tension in his posture, the way his muscles were coiled, ready to react at any moment. We need to keep moving, he said quietly, breaking the silence. We can't stay here for long. The shadow knows you're here. It's only a matter of time before it figures out where we're going. His voice had an edge to it, a warning that made her stomach turn. She nodded, though she wasn't sure where they could go. She had no idea how to escape from whatever was chasing her, and she had no answers for him. What is it they want from me? She thought again. Where are we going? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The biker paused before answering, his eyes scanning the yard as if weighing the options. There's a place, he said finally, his tone low. A place where they won't find you. But it's not safe. Not really. We'll be moving through some rough territory, and it'll be dangerous. His words made her heart race again. The idea of going into more danger was terrifying, but she knew she had no other choice. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't go back. She had to trust him. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. The biker gave her a quick nod of approval, the briefest flicker of respect in his eyes. "Stay close. Don't make any noise. Follow me, and don't ask questions." She nodded, the silence between them stretching for a moment before he moved toward the door. The sound of his boots on the ground was the only thing breaking the stillness. She stood, moving toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew she had to move. The biker stepped outside first, glancing around quickly before motioning for her to follow. The air outside was cooler, the night pressing in around them like a suffocating blanket. As they moved through the yard, the sound of the trucks grew louder, but they didn't stop. The biker led her toward the far edge of the yard, where a narrow alleyway ran between two large storage containers. The alley was dark, but she could hear the sounds of movement, the creak of metal on metal. They were not alone. She glanced around nervously, her mind racing with every footstep, every sound. The shadow was out there somewhere, waiting. The biker seemed to sense her unease, and without turning, he spoke. "Keep your head down. Don't look around too much. They'll be watching." She nodded again, trying to keep her panic under control. They moved quickly through the alley, staying low, moving from one shadow to the next. The biker was a ghost, his movements calculated, precise. She struggled to keep up, her legs feeling like lead, but she forced herself to stay close. The further they moved, the more the weight of her situation pressed down on her. She didn't know what was happening or why it was happening, but she knew one thing. She couldn't run from this forever. Eventually, the alley opened up into a wider street, and the biker stopped, his eyes scanning the area once more. He motioned for her to follow him into the street, but just as she took a step forward, a noise stopped her in her tracks. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but she heard it, a shuffle of feet, the faint sound of something scraping against the ground. She turned toward the noise, her breath catching in her throat. The shadow was closer now, moving toward them at a steady pace, and she could feel it. The biker must have sensed it too because his hand shot out, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward him. "Go," he hissed. Without thinking, she followed him, running as fast as her legs could carry her, the sound of the shadow growing closer with every step. The little black girl's heart was pounding, and her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as she ran beside the biker. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the narrow alleyway, but it was quickly drowned out by the distant rumble of trucks and the oppressive silence of the night. She could feel the presence of the shadow, its dark energy closing in on them, creeping along the walls of the alley like a predator stalking its prey. The biker was in front, leading the way with confidence, but she could see the tension in his body, the way his muscles were coiled, ready to react at any moment. She had never seen him so focused, so determined. There was no time for words now, only action. As they turned a corner, the biker motioned for her to stay close. She obeyed without hesitation, feeling a surge of fear as she glanced over her shoulder. The shadow was still there, just beyond the edge of the alley, and she knew it wasn't going to stop following them. She quickened her pace, keeping up with the biker's long strides, the adrenaline pushing her forward. The alley opened up into a more crowded street, and the biker slowed, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He looked left, then right, as if weighing his options. The city was alive around them, the hum of traffic mixing with the distant sound of voices, but none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was escaping the shadow that was still trailing them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Without warning, the biker veered off to the left, pulling her into another alleyway, narrower than the last. She had no idea where they were going, but she trusted him. She had to. "We're almost there," he muttered under his breath. The little black girl didn't respond, too focused on the path ahead and the growing feeling of dread in her chest. She could feel the shadow getting closer, its presence like a cold wind against her skin. She didn't know how long they could keep running, how much longer they could stay ahead of it. The biker seemed to sense her fear and glanced over at her, his expression hard and unreadable. "Stay calm," he said, his voice low and steady. "We're not far. Just keep moving." She nodded, though she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the pace. Her legs were aching, and her chest felt tight with every breath. But she kept going, kept running, not knowing what else to do. The alley seemed to stretch on forever, each step feeling like an eternity. The biker glanced back, checking the distance between them and the shadow. It was still there, lurking just beyond the corner, but it hadn't caught up yet. "We're close," he said again, more to himself than to her. The little black girl didn't have the strength to respond. Her mind was racing, spinning with questions she couldn't answer. What is this shadow? Why is it after me? Who are these people, and what do they want? Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud noise. A metal clang followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. She turned just in time to see the biker duck into a small, hidden doorway at the end of the alley. Without thinking, she followed him, her feet moving faster than she thought possible. As she reached the door, the biker pushed it open, and they both slipped inside, just as the shadow seemed to close in on them. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the outside world in an instant. The little black girl's breath was still coming in quick gasps, but at least they were safe for the moment. The room they had entered was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and the smell of old wood. The biker didn't waste any time, moving quickly to a set of stairs that led upward. "We can rest here for a bit," he said, though there was no sense of relief in his voice. He was just as tense as before, still alert, still on edge. The little black girl followed him up the stairs, her mind racing with fear and confusion. She didn't know what was going on, didn't understand why she was being chased. But one thing was clear, she wasn't alone anymore. The biker was with her, and for better or worse, he seemed to be the only thing standing between her and whatever it was that hunted her. At the top of the stairs, the biker stopped and motioned for her to follow him into a small room. It was empty except for a few crates and an old table, but it felt safe, for now. He moved to the table and pulled out a few small supplies, setting them down with practiced efficiency. "We'll need to lay low for a while," he said. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we move again." The little black girl nodded, though the fear still lingered. She wasn't sure how much more of this she could take. The shadow was out there, always lurking, always waiting. But for now, she was safe. And that had to be enough. The little black girl sat quietly in the dimly lit room, the weight of the silence pressing down on her shoulders. The biker had been moving around, preparing for whatever came next, but she could barely focus on anything other than the constant gnawing fear in her chest. The shadow was still out there, lurking just beyond the walls of this temporary refuge, and she knew it wouldn't be long before it found them again. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with the tension of their situation. She could hear the sounds of her own breathing, the faint rustling of the biker as he checked their supplies. He had been quiet since they entered the room, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a subtle restlessness. She could sense that he was on edge, that he was aware of the danger that was still closing in. It made her feel even more unsettled, as if the world outside this small, dusty room was ready to collapse at any moment. The biker finally stopped moving and turned to face her, his eyes hard and determined. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice steady but with an underlying urgency. "It's not safe here for long." She nodded, though she wasn't sure where they would go. She had no plan, no idea what was coming next. All she knew was that she couldn't stay here forever. The shadow was getting closer, and the biker had made it clear that they couldn't outrun it forever. They needed a way out. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The biker hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing the decision. "There's a place," he said finally, his voice low. "A safe house. It's farther out, and it's off the grid. No one will find us there." The idea of going somewhere completely unknown made her stomach twist with fear, but at the same time, it offered a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this place could be the one place where she could finally feel safe. She looked at him, trying to read his expression, but his face remained unreadable. "How far is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. The biker didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a small map from his jacket pocket and spread it out on the table in front of her. His finger traced a path along the lines of the map, showing her the route they would take. "It's a long way," he said, "but we'll have to keep moving at night. It'll be safer that way." The little black girl felt a shiver run down her spine at the thought of traveling through the night, but she knew she had no choice. There was no place for her to hide here, no way to stop the shadow from following her. She had to trust him. She had no other options. "All right," she said, nodding slowly. "I'll go with you." The biker's eyes softened just a fraction, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something resembling relief in his gaze. "We leave soon," he said. "Rest up while you can." She nodded and sat back in the chair, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The fear was still there, lurking at the edge of her mind, but she had no choice but to push it aside. She had to focus on the plan, on what came next. As the night stretched on, the biker moved around the room, gathering what little they had, preparing for the journey ahead. He worked quickly, efficiently, without hesitation. She watched him, trying to take comfort in his confidence, but it was hard. Every time she glanced at the window, every time she heard a sound outside, her heart would race, and her mind would go back to the shadow that was still waiting. It felt like it was never far away, like it was always watching, always hunting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the biker stood up and gave her a nod. "Time to go," he said. The little black girl stood up and followed him to the door, her legs feeling weak beneath her. She didn't know what awaited them, but she knew they couldn't stay here any longer. As they stepped outside, the cool night air hit her face, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The darkness was thick, oppressive, but she forced herself to focus on the path ahead. The biker led the way, his movements swift and sure, his eyes scanning the area as if he were always looking for threats. She followed closely behind, her footsteps light but quick. The shadow was still out there. She could feel it, but for now, it seemed distant. The biker kept them moving at a brisk pace, not stopping, not slowing down. They moved through the streets, staying in the shadows, always on the lookout. It was a quiet night, but it felt like anything could happen at any moment. The little black girl's mind was racing, her thoughts tumbling over each other as she wondered what would happen next. Would they make it to the safe house? Would they be able to outrun the shadow? She didn't know, but she had to keep going. She had to trust the biker. As they rounded a corner, the sound of a distant car engine caught her attention. She tensed, but the biker didn't flinch. He just kept walking, unbothered, as if nothing could shake him. She stayed close, her eyes darting around as they continued to move through the dark streets, hoping that this night would be the one that would finally bring them to safety. The little black girl's feet were sore from the constant running, but she forced herself to keep pace with the biker as they moved through the darkened streets. The city was silent around them, a strange calm that only added to the tension building in the air. Every corner they turned, every shadow they passed, felt like a moment of danger, a step closer to being caught. But the biker moved with a calm determination, as though he knew exactly where they were going, as if nothing could stop him. She didn't know how he was so confident, how he could walk through this dangerous night without a single sign of fear. Maybe it was because he had seen it all before. Maybe he was used to running from whatever it was they were running from. The little black girl didn't know what to think anymore. Her mind was filled with questions, with confusion, with fear. She had always been just a regular kid, living a quiet life, but now everything had changed. The shadow that had been following her since the very beginning was still out there, and it wasn't going to stop until it found her. The biker seemed to understand the weight of her thoughts, though he never said anything. His eyes were always scanning their surroundings, always alert. She knew he was doing his best to keep her safe, but there was only so much he could do. They could only run for so long before something caught up to them. They reached a narrow street, and the biker stopped, motioning for her to follow him into a small alleyway. The buildings around them were old, their windows boarded up, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. It was a forgotten part of the city, a place where people didn't go unless they had to. The biker glanced around before stepping into the alley, his body tense as he led her forward. The little black girl felt a chill run down her spine, but she followed without question. They passed several dark doorways, each one giving off a sense of abandonment. She felt like they were being swallowed up by the city, like it was closing in around them. The alley seemed endless, each step taking them deeper into the unknown. Finally, they reached the end of the alley, where a small, inconspicuous door stood. The biker knocked twice, a quick, sharp sound that echoed in the silence. For a moment, nothing happened, and the little black girl held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Then the door creaked open, revealing a man standing on the other side. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His expression was unreadable as he glanced at the biker, then at the little black girl. The biker gave a quick nod, and the man stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The little black girl hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with the scent of old wood and stale air. It looked like a storage room, filled with crates and boxes stacked haphazardly in the corners. There were no windows, no signs of life, just the eerie quiet that seemed to settle over everything. "You're safe here for now," the man said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "But we can't stay long. It's too risky." The biker didn't say anything, just nodded and began to move further into the room. He glanced around, checking the corners as if expecting someone to jump out at them. The little black girl stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do next. She didn't know where they were, didn't know who this man was, but for the moment, it seemed like their only option was to trust him. "What's going to happen now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man turned to look at her, his face softening for just a moment. "We wait," he said simply. "We lay low for a while, make sure we're not being followed. Then we move again." Move again. The words felt heavy in her mouth. She hadn't even processed the idea of running again, of being on the move once more. It felt like an endless cycle of fear, of never being able to stop, never being able to breathe. But she knew, deep down, that there was no choice. The shadow would never stop hunting her. She had to keep running. She had to keep moving. The biker stood near the back of the room, looking at a map spread out on a table. His finger traced a path on the map, moving from one location to another. "We're not far from the safe house now," he said, his voice low. "But we need to stay hidden. We can't let anyone know where we are." The little black girl nodded, trying to push the fear from her mind. She had to keep it together. She couldn't afford to let herself break down, not now, not when she was so close. The man who had opened the door moved to the back of the room and opened a cabinet, pulling out a few bottles of water and some food. He handed them to the biker, who nodded in thanks. They didn't say much as they settled into a corner of the room, preparing for the night ahead. The little black girl sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall, her eyes closing for a brief moment. The events of the past few days had left her exhausted, but there was no time to rest. The shadow was still out there, still waiting, and she knew they would have to keep moving soon. She only hoped that this next move would be the one that finally brought her to safety. The little black girl woke with a start, her body stiff from the cold concrete floor. Beneath her, she had fallen asleep on the floor of the small, dimly lit room, her body tired but her mind restless. The events of the past few days swirled in her head like a storm she couldn't escape. The shadow was still out there, somewhere, waiting, and she was running out of places to hide. The biker was up already, his dark figure moving silently across the room. He was checking the windows, peering out at the street beyond, scanning for any signs of danger. The man who had helped them was sitting at the corner, reading a map, and for a moment, everything seemed calm. But the calm felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. The little black girl pushed herself to her feet, her legs wobbly from lack of rest, but she didn't have time to complain. She had to be ready to move. The biker turned to her as she stood, his face hard with determination, but there was something in his eyes that softened just enough for her to notice. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and rough, like he hadn't spoken in hours. She nodded, though she didn't know if she was okay. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The biker gave a small nod and turned his attention back to the man. "We need to go now? It's time." The man looked up from the map, his eyes narrowed in thought. "The safe house is a few miles away, but we need to move quickly," he said. "There's a roadblock up ahead, and if we're not careful, we could run into trouble." The biker didn't flinch, just stood, gathering his things. "We'll find another way around." The little black girl could see the urgency in his movements, the way he quickly packed their few belongings. There was no time for hesitation, no time for rest. She felt the fear creeping in again, that gnawing feeling that something was about to go wrong. But she couldn't afford to let it take over. She couldn't afford to let herself break down. "Let's go," the biker said, his voice firm. They moved swiftly through the room, and the little black girl followed, trying to keep her footsteps light. She had to trust him. There was no other choice. As they stepped outside, the air hit her like a cold slap. The streets were empty, the usual hum of city life eerily absent. She glanced up at the sky, her eyes scanning for any signs of movement, but the world was silent. For a moment, it felt like they were the only ones left in the city, and the shadow was far behind. But she knew better than to believe it. The biker moved quickly, leading them down the narrow streets, his eyes constantly darting from side to side. They stayed close to the shadows, moving with the quiet urgency of people who were running out of time. The man followed behind them, keeping pace without a word. The little black girl tried to focus on the path ahead, but her mind kept wandering. Where are we going? How much longer before the shadow catches up? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a distant engine, the deep rumble of a car or truck approaching. The biker's body stiffened, his hand instinctively going to the side where a weapon was hidden. The little black girl's heart skipped a beat. She felt her muscles tense, ready to run if she had to. But the biker didn't flinch. He motioned for them to stop, and they pressed themselves against the side of a building, waiting in the shadows. The sound of the engine grew louder, the vehicle moving closer, but it didn't stop. It passed by, just a few feet away, and the biker relaxed, letting out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The little black girl looked up at him, her heart still racing. He didn't say anything, just motioned for them to keep moving. They continued down the street, but now every sound felt amplified, every footstep louder in her ears. The fear was back, creeping into her chest again, squeezing the air out of her lungs. They were getting closer to the roadblock. She could feel it. It was only a matter of time before they ran into trouble. But the biker kept moving, unwavering, his focus never leaving the path ahead. The little black girl couldn't help but admire his determination, the way he pushed forward without hesitation. She wanted to be as strong as him, as fearless. But she didn't know how long she could keep running, how long she could stay ahead of the shadow. They turned another corner, and the roadblock came into view. There were 2 cars parked across the street, blocking their way, and several figures standing near them, talking in low voices. The biker stopped, his body tense again, scanning the area. "We can't go through," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "We'll have to find another way." The little black girl swallowed hard, her throat dry, her mind racing. They were trapped. The shadow was closing in. There was nowhere left to run. The biker looked at her, his gaze steady, reassuring, even though she could see the same fear in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. He didn't say anything, just motioned for them to follow him. There was no other choice now. They had to move, and they had to move fast. The little black girl felt her heart hammering in her chest as they began to move again, stepping carefully around the roadblock, looking for any possible way out. The shadow was still out there, and it was only getting closer. They moved quickly, keeping to the narrow alleyways and side streets as the shadow loomed just out of sight, but always close enough to send a wave of fear down the little black girl's spine. The biker led them forward, his steps sure, despite the growing tension in the air. She stayed close behind him, her heart racing, her mind replaying every shadow, every flicker of movement she saw from the corners of her eyes. The world around them felt like it was closing in, as if the streets themselves were pressing in on her, urging her to run faster. She couldn't shake the feeling that every corner they turned, every second they spent on this path, was another step closer to being caught. They reached a quiet street, one that looked almost abandoned. The buildings were tall and worn, with cracked windows and peeling paint. The few streetlights that worked flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the pavement. The biker motioned for her to follow him into another alley, but she hesitated for a moment. Something about this street didn't feel right. She couldn't put her finger on it, but it made her skin crawl. As if sensing her hesitation, the biker looked back at her, his eyes scanning the area. "Keep moving," he said in a low voice. "We're almost there." She nodded, though she didn't fully believe him. Every instinct in her told her to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but she didn't have a choice. She had to trust him. They moved through the alley, their footsteps echoing off the walls. The further they went, the darker it became, and the little black girl couldn't help but feel like they were being led into a trap. The tension in the air was thick, and she found herself looking over her shoulder more and more. There was something about this place that made her uneasy, but she kept walking, trying to ignore the feeling that was gnawing at her. After what felt like an eternity, the biker stopped in front of a large, rusted gate. It was partially open, revealing a dark courtyard beyond. The little black girl's stomach tightened. This didn't feel like safety. It felt like another dead end. The biker turned to her, his face serious. "We'll rest here for a while. It's not much, but it'll do." She didn't say anything. She just nodded, trying to keep her fear under control. They stepped through the gate, into the courtyard, and the little black girl immediately felt a change in the atmosphere. It was as if the air was thicker here, more oppressive. The buildings surrounding them were in even worse shape than the ones on the street, some of them abandoned, their windows shattered. She could hear the faint sound of water dripping from a leaky pipe and the distant hum of a generator. This place felt like it had been forgotten by everyone, left to rot. And yet, it was better than the streets. The biker didn't waste any time. He walked toward a small door at the far end of the courtyard, his hand never straying far from the knife at his belt. The little black girl followed him, her eyes constantly scanning the shadows around them, always alert. As they reached the door, the biker stopped, giving her a quick glance. "Stay close," he warned, his voice quiet. The little black girl nodded, her pulse quickening. The door creaked open, and they stepped inside. The room they entered was small, dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was a bed in the corner, a makeshift table, and a few crates stacked against the walls. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. The biker moved to the window, peering out into the courtyard, his expression hard. The little black girl stood by the door, unsure of what to do next. She felt like she was holding her breath, like the world was waiting for something to happen. She could feel the shadow still out there, just beyond the walls, lurking. She had no idea how long they could stay here, how long they could keep running before they were found. "You should get some rest," the biker said, still watching the courtyard outside. "We'll need to leave before daylight." The little black girl nodded, though she didn't feel tired. She just couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. She moved to the bed, sitting down on the edge, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The biker didn't move from his spot by the window, his eyes constantly scanning the area. The room was silent except for the occasional sound of the wind outside and the distant hum of the generator. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to relax, but all she could think about was the shadow. It was still out there, still following them, and she had no idea how long they could keep running. She had to trust the biker, she knew that, but with every passing minute, the fear grew stronger. She didn't know if they could outrun it. She didn't know if they could survive. The biker finally turned away from the window, his eyes meeting hers for a moment before he spoke. "We'll make it," he said, his voice steady. "I won't let them get to you." His words were reassuring, but they didn't ease the fear inside her. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to feel safe. But the truth was, she didn't know how long they had before the shadow caught up with them. And in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The little black girl lay on the bed in the dark room, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts swirling in every direction. The fear that had been a constant companion since she first ran felt heavier now, more suffocating. She knew she couldn't keep running forever, but the thought of standing still, of facing whatever was hunting her, felt even worse. The shadow was always there, lurking just out of sight, and the closer it got, the more she wondered if they would ever escape it. The biker's words echoed in her mind. "We'll make it. I won't let them get to you." She wanted to believe him, but every passing second, every sound in the night, made it harder to trust that promise. She glanced over at him. He hadn't moved from his spot by the window, his eyes scanning the courtyard outside, his body tense with the constant vigilance that had kept them alive so far. He was the only one who knew how to navigate this dangerous world, how to survive it. But even he couldn't protect her forever. "How long do we stay here?" she asked quietly, not sure if he was even listening. The biker didn't turn to face her, but his voice came back soft but firm. "Not long. We can't risk staying in one place for too long. We'll move again soon. We'll find somewhere safer." The words were meant to reassure, but they had the opposite effect. She felt a chill run through her as she imagined another night on the run, another sleepless, restless journey through dark streets. She wasn't sure how much longer she could take it. She wasn't sure how much longer he could either. The silence in the room felt thick, like it was pressing in on them. She felt trapped. The reality of their situation was starting to settle into her bones. They were stuck. No matter how far they ran, no matter how many places they hid, the shadow would always be there, following them, waiting for the right moment to strike. She turned her head to look at the biker. His posture remained tense, his eyes still fixed on the courtyard outside. He was calm, controlled, as if he had faced worse than this before. as if the fear and uncertainty didn't touch him. But she knew it had to. He was human, just like her. He had to be scared. He had to be exhausted. She couldn't imagine how long he had been running, how many times he had done this before. Why did he even help me? She thought. What did he owe her? Why was he willing to put his own life on the line to protect her? It was a question that had been gnawing at her for days, but she couldn't bring herself to ask it. Maybe she was afraid of the answer. Maybe she was afraid of what it would mean if he didn't care. As the minutes ticked by, the little black girl forced herself to sit up. She couldn't stay still anymore. The walls felt like they were closing in. She needed to do something, anything, to distract herself from the overwhelming fear. She quietly got up from the bed and walked over to where the biker stood by the window. He didn't look at her, but acknowledged her presence with a slight nod. "Are we really safe here?" she asked, her voice small. His gaze flickered to her for a brief moment, and then he turned back to the window. "For now," he said, "but the world's never safe for long." The little black girl nodded, understanding more than he knew. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt truly safe. Ever since that day when everything had changed, when the shadow had first appeared, her world had been turned upside down. The biker's words were harsh, but they were true. There was no such thing as safety anymore. She wasn't even sure if she had ever truly been safe. What if we're never safe again? She thought, her chest tightening. She walked back to the bed and sat down, her mind racing with impossible thoughts. How do you keep running from something that never stops chasing you? It felt like an endless loop, and she didn't know how long she could keep up with it. She was so tired. She didn't want to keep running. She wanted to stop, to just breathe for a moment, but that was impossible. The world wasn't letting her. The shadow wasn't letting her. She had to keep moving. She had to keep going. But even as she told herself that, she knew that no matter how far they ran, there would always be a part of her that wondered if they would ever truly escape. The biker's voice broke through her thoughts. "We move at sunrise. Get some rest." She didn't respond, just nodded, her eyes closing slowly as the fatigue finally began to settle in. The fear didn't disappear, but it became easier to ignore for a moment. She curled up on the bed, trying to make herself as comfortable as possible, but the discomfort of the room, the discomfort of everything, made it impossible to fully rest. Sleep came slowly, but eventually, it overtook her. Her last thought before she closed her eyes was that tomorrow would bring another move, another step in the endless journey. And somewhere, deep down, she knew that no matter what, they would keep moving until they could run no more. The little black girl awoke to the sharp light of early morning creeping through the small cracks in the room's dusty windows. She didn't know how long she had slept, but the discomfort in her muscles told her it hadn't been nearly enough. The air in the room was still thick, heavy with the scent of old wood and damp concrete. For a moment, everything felt strangely still, and the quiet settled over her like a blanket. But she knew it wouldn't last. The fear that had gnawed at her since the beginning of this journey slowly crept back into her chest, pushing aside any remaining sense of calm. The shadow was still out there, and there was no way to outrun it forever. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. It was always there, lurking in the background, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up, but she had no choice but to move forward. The biker stood by the window, his figure dark against the pale light. He had already packed what little they had, his movements precise and efficient, as always. There was no sign of sleep in him, no sign of the exhaustion that weighed her down. She couldn't help but wonder how he did it. How could he keep going, day after day, without faltering? Did he even feel fear? "Time to move," the biker said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. She nodded, though she didn't speak. She wasn't sure what to say. There was nothing left to say. They had to keep moving, that was all. The little black girl stood up, the world spinning for a moment as the dizziness from her sleepless night hit her. She steadied herself on the wall and moved toward the door, her heart already pounding in her chest. The biker had already opened the door, and the cool morning air hit her face, fresh but filled with the same tension that had haunted her for so long. The streets outside were quiet, but the silence felt different today, more oppressive, as if the city itself was holding its breath. They moved swiftly through the streets, their footsteps quick but measured, always aware, always scanning for danger. The little black girl kept her head low, trying to blend into the shadows of the alleyways, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. It was like the entire city was alive, waiting to betray them. She glanced at the biker, who was walking ahead of her with that same calm, focused demeanor. How could he be so steady? She wanted to ask him, but she knew there was no point. He wouldn't tell her anything she didn't already know, that they had to survive, no matter the cost. As they rounded another corner, a low hum reached her ears, the sound of a car engine. The biker stopped immediately, his body going rigid. She could feel her pulse quicken in response, her instincts telling her to run, but the biker didn't move. He listened, his eyes scanning the street ahead. The car was coming closer, and she could see the shape of it now, a black sedan with tinted windows. She held her breath, and the biker motioned for her to stay still. The car slowed as it approached, and the little black girl could feel her heartbeat in her throat. The car came to a stop just a few feet away, the engine idling, the silence stretching between them like a dangerous thread. She could hear the faint sound of the car doors locking, the sound of someone inside shifting. The biker stepped into the shadows, pulling her with him, his grip firm on her arm. The little black girl pressed herself against the wall, trying to melt into the shadows, praying they wouldn't be seen. The car stayed there for what felt like an eternity, and she could feel her muscles aching from the tension, from the stillness. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the car started moving again, its engine revving as it sped away down the street. The biker let out a breath he had been holding, and the little black girl exhaled sharply, her legs shaking. That was too close, the biker muttered under his breath. She didn't respond. There was nothing to say. They had been lucky this time, but luck wouldn't last forever. The shadow was still out there, and it wouldn't stop until it found them. The biker continued walking, his pace slightly faster now, and the little black girl followed, her heart still racing. She didn't know where they were going, but she knew one thing. They had to keep moving, always moving. The world was closing in on them, and there was no way to stop it. No way to fight back. All they could do was run. The city was just as dangerous as it had been the night before, but now it felt even more suffocating. The little black girl felt like she was being swallowed by the streets, like they were conspiring against her, trying to pull her under. But she kept moving, kept following the biker through the labyrinth of streets and alleyways. She didn't know how much longer they could keep running. She didn't know if she could keep running. But for now, there was no other choice. She had to survive, and the only way to do that was to keep moving. Keep going. There was no other option. The little black girl's legs ached from the constant movement, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to rest, not when every step was a reminder that the shadow was still out there, lurking just behind her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The biker's steady presence was the only thing that kept her moving forward. He had become her anchor in this storm of uncertainty, but even he couldn't stop the fear that gnawed at her from the inside. They had been on the run for days, moving from place to place, always looking over their shoulders, never able to stop for long. The city around them felt like a maze, its narrow streets and towering buildings closing in on them, making it harder to breathe with every passing moment. But the biker was always calm, always focused, always pushing forward. She tried to keep up, her footsteps light and quick, but she was exhausted, and she could feel it in every step she took. "How much further?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The biker didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. His silence said it all. They were nearing the end of their route, and the moment they stopped moving, the shadow would be on them. She could feel it in her bones. It was coming, and they didn't have much time left. They reached another abandoned building, its windows boarded up, its walls covered in graffiti. The little black girl looked at it with a mixture of relief and dread. This was the place they had been heading toward, the place the biker had promised would be safe. But nothing had felt safe for a long time. The biker didn't stop, just moved toward the back of the building, where a narrow door stood. He knocked twice, a sharp, quick sound that echoed in the stillness. The door creaked open, revealing a dark figure standing on the other side. The figure didn't say anything, just stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The little black girl hesitated for a moment, looking back at the empty street. The world outside felt so much more dangerous now, as if it was closing in around her. She felt a chill run down her spine, but there was no choice. She had to go inside. She stepped over the threshold and into the darkness beyond, her heart pounding in her chest. The biker followed closely behind her, his presence solid and reassuring. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was a small table in the center of the room, covered in papers and maps, and a few chairs scattered around. It wasn't much, but it was better than the streets. The figure who had let them in closed the door behind them, locking it with a loud click. He turned to face them, his face shadowed by the low light. "You're safe for now," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But we can't stay here long. The city's crawling with eyes." The biker nodded, but didn't say anything. The little black girl looked around the room, trying to find something to focus on, something that would take her mind off the weight of everything pressing down on her. But there was nothing. The room was empty, save for the table and chairs, and the flickering light that only seemed to make the shadows deeper. The tension was thick in the air, suffocating. She glanced at the biker again, wondering how long they could keep this up. How long before the shadow found them again. "We wait. Here," the figure said, breaking her thoughts. "We can't move yet. You need to rest. You need to be ready for what comes next." The little black girl nodded, though she wasn't sure how to rest when her mind was still racing, her body still on high alert. She wasn't sure if she could ever truly rest again. The fear was too strong, too constant. The biker moved to the table, spreading out the map, his eyes scanning the streets, looking for any sign of danger. The figure didn't move, just stood by the door, his eyes constantly darting to the shadows, always watching. The little black girl sat down in one of the chairs, her body tense, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The silence was deafening. Her thoughts kept racing back to the shadow, to the thing that had been following her since the beginning. It wasn't just some random figure. It was something darker, something that had been stalking her for a reason. She didn't know what that reason was, but she knew one thing for sure. It wasn't going to stop until it had her. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. She looked at the biker, wondering if he had any answers, wondering if he could tell her how to get out of this. But he didn't look at her. His focus was entirely on the map in front of him, on the path ahead. He was always looking ahead, always preparing for what came next. And she realized then that maybe that was the key. She couldn't look back anymore. She couldn't keep running from something she didn't understand. She had to keep moving forward, keep fighting, no matter how impossible it seemed. The biker looked up from the map, his gaze meeting hers for a brief moment. "Rest now," he said, his voice calm, steady. "We leave at first light. The shadow can't reach us if we stay ahead of it." She nodded, trying to push her fear aside, trying to believe that he was right. But the truth was, she didn't know how much longer they could keep running. She didn't know if they could outrun the shadow for much longer. But for now, all she could do was trust him and keep moving. Keep going, because that was the only choice they had. The little black girl sat on the edge of the chair, her mind whirling with the thoughts that kept her up during the long, silent hours of the night. The fear still gnawed at her, relentless and unyielding, like a shadow that never left. She wanted to rest, to believe the biker's words, but each time she closed her eyes, she felt the weight of the shadow drawing nearer. The fear wasn't just from the unknown. It was from the feeling of being hunted, always on the edge of being caught. The biker hadn't been wrong about one thing. The shadow had a purpose. It was closing in, and there was no escaping it forever. The room was quiet except for the faint rustling of the papers on the table where the biker had laid out a map of their route. The man who had let them in earlier stood by the door, a silent sentinel, his eyes darting back and forth between the windows and the door, always watching. He hadn't spoken much since they entered, but his presence added to the tension that hung thick in the air. The little black girl could feel the suffocating silence pressing down on her, making the fear in her chest feel even heavier. The biker glanced over at her from across the room, his face hard and unreadable. "You should rest," he said again, his voice a low rumble that seemed to reverberate in the stillness. She looked at him, at the determination in his eyes, and she wanted to believe him. She wanted to feel safe for once. But every time she thought about resting, she couldn't shake the thought that they would never make it to the safe house, that the shadow would find them long before they could get there. She had seen it too many times before, things that felt like they were just out of reach, only to be taken away in an instant. "I don't know if I can," she whispered, more to herself than to him. The biker didn't respond at first, just continued to study the map on the table. He didn't seem like the type to waste words. "The road ahead is dangerous," he said after a moment, his voice steady, calm. as though he had faced this kind of danger before. But we'll make it. As long as we keep moving, we stand a chance. She nodded slowly, though. She wasn't sure if she believed him. It wasn't just about running. It was about surviving. Every step they took felt like it could be their last. Every second was a reminder that the world outside this room was a place of constant danger. The little black girl couldn't help but wonder if they were too late. Maybe the shadow had already caught up with them. Maybe it was too late to escape. But the biker was right about one thing. They had to keep moving. They had no other choice. The silence between them stretched for what felt like forever, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, louder than the ticking of the clock on the wall. She glanced over at the man by the door, who still hadn't moved, his eyes fixed on the darkened street outside. He had the look of someone who had been waiting for a long time, someone who had seen the dangers that the world had to offer. It made her wonder how long he had been living like this, constantly moving, never staying in one place for too long, never letting their guard down. The biker looked at her again, his eyes softer now, though still full of that same determination. "We can't stay here forever," he said, his voice low. "We need to move when the sun sets. The safe house is close, but we can't risk staying exposed. They'll be looking for us." She nodded, but the fear in her chest didn't fade. The shadow was still out there. They hadn't outrun it. It was still waiting. The man by the door shifted, breaking the silence. "I'll keep watch," he said quietly, his voice rough. "You two get ready." The biker nodded in acknowledgement, and the little black girl stood up slowly, stretching her stiff legs. The room felt too small, too suffocating, and she could feel the weight of everything pressing in on her. Every breath was a struggle, every thought a battle to keep the fear from overwhelming her. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up. The road ahead was uncertain, and no matter how many times they moved, it felt like they were always one step away from being caught. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't give up. Not now. The shadow had already taken so much from her. She wasn't going to let it take everything. She glanced at the biker again, who was already gathering the few belongings they had. He moved with precision, his every action calculated, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. She realized then that he was just like her, not immune to fear, but willing to face it, willing to keep fighting. She had to be the same. She couldn't let fear decide what happened next. "Are we ready?" she asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that still churned in her gut. The biker gave a small nod. "We'll move out soon. Just keep close." The little black girl took a deep breath, steadying herself. The time to run was almost here, and this time, they would not stop until they were safe, whatever that meant. And as she moved toward the door, she knew one thing for sure. No matter what came next, she would face it with him, one step at a time. The little black girl stood at the edge of the alley, her heart pounding in her chest, every nerve on high alert. The biker was already moving, his footsteps steady and sure as he led the way through the winding streets, his figure a dark silhouette against the dimming sky. The air was thick with the weight of the moment. Every sound seemed magnified, her own breath, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. But it wasn't the world around her that held her attention. It was the shadow that had followed her for as long as she could remember, the shadow that had haunted every step, every decision, every fleeting moment of peace. And now, as they moved deeper into the city, she could feel it, closing in. The fear that had been building in her chest ever since they began this journey was now a raw, gnawing presence. But there was something else too, a sense of finality. She wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running, but she knew one thing for certain. It had to end. No more hiding, no more running. They couldn't outrun this forever. They had to face it. The biker led her down a narrow side street, and for a moment, they stopped. He turned to her, his face hard and unreadable. His eyes, always so focused and determined, softened for just a second. "We're close," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. She nodded, though she wasn't sure what he meant by close. Close to what? The safe house? Or something worse? But she didn't ask. She didn't need to. They had reached the point where answers no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was survival. The biker started moving again, and she followed, her body heavy with exhaustion, but driven by an urgency she couldn't ignore. They reached the end of the street, and the little black girl's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the shadow. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was here, somewhere in the city, watching them. She clenched her fists, trying to steady herself. The shadow wasn't just a thing, a presence. It was her past, her fears, her uncertainty, all wrapped into one. And no matter how far she ran, no matter how many walls she hid behind, it always caught up. But now it was different. She had the biker with her. She wasn't alone anymore. They reached a small door, barely noticeable against the worn brick of the building. The biker knocked twice, quick and sharp. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a woman standing on the other side. She was tall and thin, her eyes sharp and calculating, but there was no malice in her gaze. She stepped aside, allowing them to enter without a word. The little black girl hesitated for a moment, but the biker didn't stop. He just kept moving, and she followed, her feet heavy against the cold floor. The room they entered was dimly lit, sparse, just a few chairs, a table, and a few crates stacked in the corners. But it felt different. It felt like safety, like a place where the world outside couldn't reach them. For the first time in days, the little black girl allowed herself to breathe, just for a moment. But even then, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was still out there. The woman closed the door behind them, locking it with a soft click. She turned to face them. "You're safe here, for now," she said, her voice steady but not comforting. The biker didn't respond, his eyes scanning the room before finally resting on the woman. "We need to move again soon," he said. "We can't stay here for long." The woman nodded. "I know," she said, "but for tonight, you can rest. Tomorrow, we'll figure out our next move." The little black girl glanced at the biker, but he didn't look at her. He just nodded, his expression still hard, still distant. She didn't know what he was thinking, but she understood. The journey wasn't over. It would never be over until they had faced the shadow, until they had confronted whatever it was that had been chasing them all this time. The woman led them further into the room, toward a small table where a few supplies had been set out, water, bread, and a small, flickering lamp. The little black girl sat down, her body aching from the constant motion, from the constant fear. She wanted to close her eyes, to let the exhaustion take her, but she couldn't. She knew that the moment she let her guard down, the shadow would find her. The silence in the room grew heavy, but it wasn't just the silence of the moment. It was the silence of what was to come. The shadow had followed them here, and now it was time to face it. The little black girl felt a surge of fear rise in her chest, but she pushed it aside. She had made it this far. She had to keep going. She had to face whatever came next. The biker finally spoke, breaking the silence. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "We leave before sunrise." The little black girl nodded, though her mind was still racing, still filled with thoughts of the shadow, of what awaited them in the hours to come. But she didn't speak. She couldn't. She had already come too far to turn back now. And as she closed her eyes, the weight of everything pressing down on her, she knew this was it. The final step. The moment they would either outrun the shadow for good or face it head-on. The little black girl was ready. She had to be. In this gripping chapter of the ongoing Hell Angels stories, the journey of a young girl continues as she tries to escape the shadow that relentlessly chases her. Along the way, she finds an unlikely ally in a mysterious biker who promises to protect her. Together, they navigate through dark alleys and abandoned streets, always on the run, as the looming threat of the shadow grows stronger. The tension builds as they seek refuge in hidden places, but the girl can't shake the feeling that they are never truly safe. The biker, a man with a past shrouded in mystery, leads the way with unwavering determination. As they move from one secret location to the next, they are forced to confront the reality of their situation. There is no escaping the shadow. This part of the Hell Angel stories takes readers on a high-stakes journey, filled with suspense and uncertainty, as the girl and the biker face impossible odds. Will they outrun the shadow, or will it catch up with them at the last moment? The Hell Angel stories are full of unexpected twists, keeping you on the edge of your seat as they unfold.